Howdy, this video will cover parent functions. Now, a parent function is the simplest form of a function, and there are many different forms of functions. We have constant functions, linear functions, polynomial, even functions, which are quadratic, polynomial odd, which are cubic, absolute value, square root, exponential, logarithmic, rational, sine, cosine, and tangent. Let's jump on in. So there are three important things you need to know for parent functions: domain, range, and graph. Pretty much it. Here's our first function, constant. So constant as f of x equals c, where c can be any number. So for the sake of this graph, let's go ahead and say that c equals 4, meaning f of x will equal 4. Now, f of x can be replaced with y, so we'll have y equals 4 as our equation, and that's going to be at y equals 4, right there. So our line is right here, a horizontal line crossing through 4. So the domain for this will be from, we have an arrow, so negative infinity, to arrow, so left to right is arrow to arrow, so it's going to be negative infinity to positive infinity. Now our range for a parent function, the only thing our y-axis is 4. So for our parent function, y for our range will always be whatever c is. So y would be c for your domain and range. So remember, you need to know your graph and your domain and range for your parent functions. Now, linear and absolute value. Linear is here, absolute value is here. Our linear parent function is just a linear equation with no y-intercept and a slope of 1. So it's going to go through the origin and have a slope of 1. So that's your linear equation. So that means for our domain, it will be from left to right, which is arrow to arrow, which is going to be negative infinity to infinity. And our range will be bottom to top, which is negative infinity to positive infinity, because of our arrow to arrow. Now our absolute value function, very similar to a linear function, but we don't have any negatives. So it's going to be like that and like that. The absolute value turns all of our negatives into positives. So that's why it reflects out the x-axis. So for our domain, again, it's from left to right, which is arrow to arrow, meaning it's going to be negative infinity to infinity. Our range will be bottom to top, and it starts at 0 right there, and it goes all the way to arrow, which is infinity. So 0 to infinity. Now this 0 here is actually touching the line, meaning it will be included, meaning we need to use a bracket. And then infinity is always going to be a parenthesis. Now, reciprocal. We have two types of reciprocal, one with the 1x and one with x squared. Let's go ahead and do the 1x first, and that graph would look like this. Okay, so we need to find the domain and range of this. Now, this one's a little tricky because we have asymptotes at the y and x axis, meaning that our domain and range will not be at 0. Okay, they will not include 0. Meaning, so if we go from left to right for our domain, we're going to start at arrow, which is infinity, well, negative infinity, and then we're going to stop right before 0. So stop at 0. Now, since we're stopping right at 0 and we have an asymptote at 0, that means we can't include 0, meaning we're going to use a parenthesis. And then open up parenthesis. It's going to start back up at 0 and then go all the way to your arrow, which is infinity. So 0 to infinity. But that right there is two separate domains, but we need one domain. So in order to combine those, we're going to use our symbol U for union, which means it just combines those two domains into a single domain. So we're going to go from negative infinity to 0, and then 0 to infinity. All right. So the range is the same exact thing, because we go from our arrow to our asymptote to our arrow. Meaning, we're just going to have negative infinity to 0, union 0 to infinity. Now for our other reciprocal with the x squared, it looks just like this. Okay, so domain is just like these ones right there. All right, it's going to go from arrow to asymptote, asymptote to arrow. So negative infinity to 0, union 0 to infinity. Now our range is a little different because we don't have anything down here. Everything's positive. So it's going to start at our asymptote of x at 0. So it's going to start at 0, and go all the way to your arrows, so infinity. Now, since we have an asymptote at 0, that also means we're not going to include 0. So use a parenthesis to infinity. Polynomial even and polynomial odd. Polynomial even is where n here is even. Pretty simple. And it's going to look just like your quadratic equation. Quadratic function, which is right here and there. So there's your u, your quadratic equation. So your domain for this, left to right, arrow to arrow, will be negative infinity to infinity. But our range starts at 0, touching, so it's going to include 0, and go all the way to arrows, meaning infinity. Now your polynomial odd, a little different, starts at 0, 0, 1, 1, 2, 8, 1, 1, 2, 8. Okay. So then your function looks like this, somewhat good enough. Okay, so that's your polynomial odd. So domain for this. So for domain, we're gonna go left to right, which is arrow to arrow, meaning we're gonna have negative infinity to infinity. And then for range, as from bottom to top, which is arrow to arrow, meaning it's going to be negative infinity to infinity. Okay. Then the last three, we have square root function, we have exponential, and we have logarithmic. Meaning, so let's go ahead and draw these. So square root is right here. Exponential is right here. And logarithmic is right here. Okay. So for a domain for our square root, it begins at 0, left to right. So it begins at 0 and ends at arrow. So it means, and it also starts at 0 by touching it. So it's going to include 0 and go to infinity. And then range will be from bottom, which is also 0, and top, which is also arrow. So then range is the same thing, 0 to infinity. And then domain for exponential, left to right, we have arrow to arrow. So domain will be negative infinity to infinity. Range will be, so for range, we have an asymptote right here at x equals 0. Well, at y equals 0, at your x-axis. So it's not going to touch 0, but it will get really, really, really close to it. So we're going to start at 0, but not include it. So parentheses 0. Yeah, and then it goes all the way up to arrow, meaning infinity. Then last one, really simple, logarithmic and exponential are exact opposites. Okay, because this is reflected across the diagonal and this right there. Same exact graph, just reflected. So domain will be the exact opposite of exponential. So in other words, the domain will be the range from exponential, and the range will be the domain from exponential. So domain will be 0 to infinity, and range will be negative infinity to infinity. Okay, and that's it. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to do your worksheets, do notes, study, blah, blah, blah. Okay, bye.